Military boots against metal froze me in place that night in Hangar 7. In 23 years of aircraft maintenance, I had learned to distinguish every noise an aircraft could make: the ping of cooling metal, the hiss of hydraulics, the groan of settling wings. But these footsteps, these were different. They echoed through the empty cargo bay of the C-141 with deliberate precision, moving with a purpose that made my skin crawl. The digital display on my tablet read 247 hours. I was the only soul authorized to be in this hangar, conducting a routine maintenance check that had become anything but routine. The massive starlifter stretched before me, its cavernous interior darker than usual, as if the shadows themselves were consuming my industrial-grade flashlight's beam. The rational part of my mind, the part that had earned me the Chief Master Sergeant rank, tried to dismiss it as thermal expansion in the cold night air. But then I saw it, a silhouette, unmistakably human in form, gliding past the rear loading ramp. My breath caught as it moved toward the tail section, the exact spot where Airman Thompson had met his end 3 decades ago. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that frost began forming on my testing equipment. Through the condensation of my own breath, I watched the vapor twist into shapes that defied explanation. Then came the whispers. Not the ambient noise of an aircraft settling, but clear, urgent communications cutting through the static of emptiness. Standard protocol demanded I report any unauthorized presence immediately. But something held me there, transfixed. A combination of professional curiosity and an inexplicable pull toward that shadowed tail section. I had spent my entire career trusting in gauges, measurements, and maintenance manuals. But what happened next would shatter every certainty I had built my life upon. I had been working on C-141S for over 2 decades, but I had never bothered to dig deep into Airman Thompson's story until that night. After my encounter, I spent days in the base archives, piecing together the truth. It happened in 1983, during a routine maintenance check. Thompson was a young airman, eager to prove himself. He had volunteered to inspect the tail section, a cramped, claustrophobic space that most experienced mechanics dreaded. The official report was maddeningly vague: fatal accident during routine maintenance procedures. But the unofficial story, passed down through generations of maintenance crews, painted a far darker picture. Thompson had become trapped in the tail section when the access panel malfunctioned. For 6 hours, he had been stuck in that metal coffin, radio dead, banging on the walls as the temperature dropped. By the time they found him, it was too late. What haunted me most were the details I uncovered in personal accounts from the rescue team. They described finding Thompson's flashlight, still clutched in his frozen hands, the beam pointing at scratches in the metal wall. He had tried to claw his way out. But it was the last entry in his maintenance log that chilled me to my core. Written in increasingly shaky handwriting, "Something is in here with me. I can hear it breathing." The base commander had dismissed it as hallucinations brought on by hypothermia and panic. But after what I had experienced, I was not so sure. The more I dug, the more stories I found. Decades of maintenance crews reporting strange occurrences in and around that aircraft. Footsteps, whispers, tools disappearing and reappearing in impossible places, cold spots that defied explanation. Each incident had been carefully documented, then quietly filed away. But there was a pattern emerging, and I was beginning to understand why that particular C-141 had earned its nickname among the maintenance crews, Thompson's Tomb. The rational part of my mind demanded evidence, something concrete I could document and prove. So I established an investigation, technically off the books, but with the quiet support of a few trusted colleagues. We installed motion sensors, infrared cameras, and audio recording equipment throughout the aircraft. For 3 weeks, we gathered data during the graveyard shift, when the encounters seemed most frequent. The results defied explanation. The motion sensors would trigger in sequence, as if tracking someone walking through the cargo bay, but the cameras showed nothing. The audio recordings captured footsteps, metallic tapping, and something else. A voice, barely above a whisper, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Let me out." The temperature data was even more puzzling. We recorded dramatic temperature drops, sometimes as much as 30 degrees in a matter of seconds, always centered around the tail section. But the most compelling evidence came during our third week of monitoring. I was reviewing the data alone one night when all the equipment simultaneously malfunctioned. Every screen went dark, every sensor flatlined. Then, in the silence, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone climbing the metal ladder to the tail section. The security footage from that night, recovered hours later, shows me sitting at the monitoring station. At exactly 0247 hours, a figure appears behind me. It is there for just 3 frames, but the image is clear enough. A young man in an airman's uniform, his face contorted in a silent scream. When I finally worked up the courage to show the footage to one of the older mechanics, he went pale. "That is Thompson," he whispered. Exactly how he looked the day they found him. After seeing Thompson's ghost on camera, I knew I had to face whatever was haunting that aircraft. I chose the anniversary of his death, believing the connection would be strongest then. I entered the C-141 alone at midnight, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a digital recorder. The cargo bay felt different that night, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. The air was dense, like walking through invisible cobwebs. I made my way to the tail section, following the now familiar sound of footsteps. The temperature dropped with each step until my teeth were chattering. Then I saw him, as clear as any living person, Airman Thompson, standing at the base of the ladder leading to the tail section. His uniform was pristine, but his eyes, they held decades of isolation and desperation. He did not speak, just pointed upward toward the tail section access panel. I understood what he wanted. Following his gesture, I climbed the ladder, my hands shaking so badly I nearly lost my grip. The access panel was sealed, just as it had been that fatal night. But as I reached for it, something impossible happened. My flashlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I felt icy fingers wrap around my wrist. Thompson's voice, clear and urgent, whispered in my ear, "Not alone. Never alone. It is still in there." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. Whatever had been in that tail section with Thompson 30 years ago, whatever he had heard breathing in the darkness, it was still there. And now I was beginning to understand why his spirit could not rest. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more terrifying than any ghost story. Working with a small team of trusted investigators, we began connecting incidents across multiple air bases. The C-141 Thompson died in was not unique. Similar accidents had occurred in other aircraft of the same model, always in the tail section, always during solitary maintenance checks. But the official reports had been sanitized, the details buried in classified documents. Through a network of retired mechanics and former crew members, we pieced together a pattern spanning decades. Each incident shared common elements: unexplained noises, dramatic temperature drops, and maintenance personnel reporting a presence in the tail section. But it was a declassified document from 1962 that finally provided answers. During the Cold War, the Air Force had experimented with using the tail sections of C-141s for classified cargo that, according to the document, required special containment protocols. Something had gone wrong during one of those transports. Whatever they were containing got loose. The document ended there, heavily redacted. But Thompson's last words suddenly made horrifying sense. He had not been alone in that tail section, and what had been trapped in there with him was not human. The ghost we had been investigating was not just Thompson. He was trying to warn us. Every footstep, every whisper, every cold spot had been his attempt to prevent others from meeting the same fate he did. I am breaking my silence now because the public needs to know the truth. Since that night in the tail section, 3 more maintenance workers have disappeared across different air bases. Each time, the official story cites mechanical failure or human error. Each time, the aircraft is quietly decommissioned and replaced, but the pattern continues. The entity that killed Thompson is still out there, moving from aircraft to aircraft, waiting in the dark spaces where solitary maintenance workers go. Thompson's spirit remains too, following it, trying to warn others. I hear his footsteps sometimes, late at night when I am alone in the hangar. They are faster now, more urgent, as if he knows time is running out. The Air Force has tried to suppress this story, but they cannot hide the truth forever. Too many people have seen what I have seen, heard what I have heard. The evidence is there for those who dare to look. So if you are a maintenance worker, especially on the older aircraft, pay attention to the signs. If you hear footsteps in an empty cargo bay, if you feel a sudden cold spot, if you see a young airman trying to warn you, do not ignore it. Thompson died trying to expose the truth, and his spirit will not rest until someone finally listens. Because the most terrifying part of this story is not the ghost. It is the thing that created him. And it is still out there, waiting in the dark, breathing in the silence of empty cargo bays, hungry for its next victim. I still wake up screaming some nights, my sheets soaked in cold sweat. The locals warned us, but we didn't listen. How could we? We were trained soldiers, equipped with the latest military gear and years of combat experience. But nothing, absolutely nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered in that remote village. It started during a routine patrol in the mountains. We were 11 days into our deployment when an elderly woman frantically waved us down, her eyes wide with terror. She spoke in broken English, telling us about a creature that had been terrorizing their livestock. At first, we thought it was just another wild animal story. The locals often dealt with wolves or bears. But when she mentioned it walked on 2 legs and stood taller than any man she'd ever seen, something in her voice made my skin crawl. That night, as we set up our forward operating base near the village, we heard the first screams. They weren't human, at least. They didn't sound human. The howls echoed through the valley, bouncing off the mountainsides until it felt like they were coming from everywhere at once. Our squad leader, Martinez, tried to radio back to base, but all we got was static. That's when we noticed the temperature had dropped drastically. In the middle of summer, we could see our breath. I'll never forget what Phillips said next. "Guys, something's watching us." We all felt it. That heavy, oppressive feeling of being hunted. When we turned on our thermal imaging equipment, what we saw made my blood run cold. Dozens of heat signatures surrounded our position, but they kept flickering in and out, like nothing I'd ever seen before. The next morning, we decided to investigate the village more thoroughly. The locals were reluctant to talk at first, but fear has a way of loosening tongues. They told us about the disappearances that had started 3 months ago. First, it was just livestock. Sheep torn apart in their pens, cattle found mutilated in the fields. But then, people started vanishing. Always at night, always when they were alone. The village elder finally opened up about their legend of the mountain walker, a creature that had supposedly protected these valleys for centuries. But something had changed. The entity had become aggressive, territorial. As he spoke, I noticed strange markings carved into the doorframes of every house, ancient symbols meant to ward off evil. We documented everything, took photos of the strange tracks we found, massive footprints that seemed to appear and disappear randomly, as if whatever made them could phase in and out of existence. The prints were nearly 2 feet long with what looked like 6 toes. Our team medic, Rodriguez, discovered something even more disturbing: trace amounts of radiation around the areas where the attacks had occurred. The readings weren't lethal, but they weren't natural either. As we collected samples, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The villagers wouldn't go near the mountain caves, saying they were doorways. Doorways to what? They wouldn't say, but their fear was palpable. Every time we approached the cave system, our equipment would malfunction. Compasses spun wildly, radios erupted in bursts of static, and our GPS devices showed us in completely different locations. It happened during our 3rd night of surveillance. We'd set up motion sensors and cameras around the village perimeter. At 0200 hours, everything went haywire simultaneously. The temperature plummeted again, and that's when we heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It was like 1,000 whispers overlapping, but not in any language I'd ever heard. The motion sensors were triggering in a pattern, moving toward our position with impossible speed. Martinez ordered us to switch to thermal imaging, but the batteries in our equipment were suddenly dead. All of them, even our backup units. The moonlight cast long shadows across the village, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow moving between the houses. But shadows don't have mass. Shadows don't leave footprints that smoke when they touch the ground. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen, fluid yet jerky, like watching a glitch in reality. Standing at least 9 feet tall, its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, joints bending in impossible ways. When it turned toward us, I saw its face, or rather the absence of one. Just smooth, dark flesh where features should be, with faint bioluminescent patterns shifting beneath the surface. The air felt electric, charged with some kind of energy that made our hair stand on end. Phillips raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the creature moved. In the blink of an eye, it crossed 30 feet of open ground. The last thing I remember was its hand, if you could call it that, reaching toward us, fingers elongating like smoke. We lost Phillips that night. Not dead, just gone. There 1 second, vanished the next. The military conducted a full search operation, but they found nothing. No body, no trace, no evidence he ever existed except for his dog tags, which we found melted into a perfect sphere. The official report blamed it on a training accident, but we knew better. The creature became bolder after that. It started appearing in broad daylight, standing at the edge of the forest, watching. The villagers barricaded themselves in their homes, burning sacred herbs and chanting prayers that sounded ancient. Our reinforcements arrived, but they were useless. How do you fight something that doesn't seem to exist in our reality? The scientists they sent were even more disturbed by their findings. The radiation levels had spiked, and they detected what they called temporal anomalies around the cave systems. Time itself seemed to move differently near the mountains. Watches would run backward, digital displays showed impossible dates, and some of us swore we saw events happen before they actually occurred. The military wanted to shut down the entire operation, classify everything, but it was too late. The entity had marked us somehow. We could feel it in our dreams, visions of impossible geometries and spaces that shouldn't exist. Even when we left the village, it followed. Not physically, but in our minds, calling to us, showing us things no human was meant to see. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A linguistics professor who specialized in ancient languages discovered that the symbols carved into the village doorframes weren't protective wards, they were warnings. The villagers hadn't been trying to keep something out, they were trying to keep something in. The caves weren't just caves, they were containment sites, built thousands of years ago by a civilization lost to time. The creature wasn't some random monster, it was a guardian, a sentinel left behind to watch over something far worse. Our presence, our military activity, had disrupted the ancient boundaries. We had unknowingly interfered with a containment protocol that had worked for millennia. The radiation, the temporal anomalies, the strange phenomena, they were all side effects of whatever was trying to break free. The entity wasn't hunting us, it was trying to warn us, trying to make us leave before we accidentally released something that could potentially end our world as we know it. But we couldn't leave, not without Phillips. And deep down, we all knew he wasn't just missing. He had become part of something else, something that existed between the spaces we could perceive. The professor's translations revealed one final, terrifying truth. We weren't dealing with a single entity. What we saw was just a projection, a tiny piece of something vast and incomprehensible. They're shutting down this investigation now. Too many witnesses have started showing signs of what they're calling temporal displacement syndrome. People aging decades overnight, others appearing in 2 places simultaneously, some seemingly moving backward through time. The village has been evacuated. The entire area declared a military exclusion zone. But it's too late for some of us. We've seen too much, know too much. The dreams are getting worse. We see Phillips sometimes, or what used to be Phillips. He appears in mirrors, in windows, trying to tell us something. His mouth moves, but the words don't match any known language. The symbols have started appearing on our skin, burning themselves into our flesh while we sleep. The military has us under quarantine now, studying us like lab rats. They don't understand that they can't contain this with concrete walls and armed guards. The entity showed us the truth. Our reality is just a thin veneer. a fragile membrane separating us from things that defy comprehension. The caves are still there, still waiting. Sometimes in the dead of night, I can feel it calling, pulling at something deep inside my consciousness. And I know, with terrifying certainty, that one day, those ancient barriers will fail completely. When that happens, what crawls out won't just be walking on two legs. It will reshape our world into something unrecognizable. So I'm leaving this record, this warning. If you're watching this, if you ever find yourself in those mountains, and you hear whispers in an impossible language, run as fast and as far as you can. Because what's coming isn't just hunting us anymore, it's awakening. I will never forget the night I first saw it. We were deep into our night training at Camp Pendleton, a routine drill meant to sharpen our senses in the darkness. The air was thick with humidity, and the only sounds were our boots crunching against the gravel and the distant rustle of the trees. Then, I saw it just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. A figure. At first, I thought it was one of us, maybe a drill sergeant watching from a distance. But as my eyes adjusted, my stomach twisted into a knot. The figure was tall, hunched, and dressed in something unnervingly out of place, what looked like a clown suit. The dull glow of red and white smeared across its form sent an immediate wave of dread through my chest. I nudged the guy next to me. "You see that?" But before he could respond, the figure stepped back, swallowed by the shadows. I rushed forward, my heart hammering, but when I reached the spot there was nothing. Just an eerie silence hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. That was the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Word traveled fast. By the next night, everyone in our unit had heard about the figure in the woods. Some laughed it off, calling it a prank, a hallucination, a trick of the light. But those of us who had seen it knew better. The way it vanished wasn't natural. It didn't just move, it dissolved into the darkness, like smoke being pulled away by an invisible force. Then more of us started seeing it. A flash of red and white between the trees, a hunched figure standing just at the edge of our vision. Every time we tried to get closer, it was gone. It left no tracks, no sign that anything had been there at all. The officers told us to ignore it, to focus on training. But how could we? The feeling of being watched was unbearable. Our night drills became torturous. The air felt colder, the darkness felt thicker, and that strange, suffocating silence, it followed us everywhere. Then, one night, something changed. One of our own went missing. We were halfway through an endurance drill when Corporal Simmons fell behind. It wasn't unusual fatigue caught up with everyone eventually, but when we finished the drill and regrouped, Simmons was nowhere to be found. We searched the immediate area, shouting his name, our voices swallowed by the night. Then we heard a noise, a distant, hollow laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was there, high-pitched, unnatural, echoing through the trees. Every hair on my body stood on end. "Simmons!" someone yelled. No response. We fanned out, moving with the discipline we had drilled into us. But the deeper we searched, the more we felt it, something watching, something waiting. Then we saw something ahead, just a flash of movement. Red and white. Simmons' voice, barely audible. "Help me." We sprinted towards the sound. But when we reached the clearing, there was nothing. No Simmons. No clown. Only the silence. The officers finally took it seriously. A full search party was organized, and we scoured the area until dawn. No trace of Simmons. No sign of a struggle. Nothing. It was as if he had been erased from existence. Then came the worst part. When the sun rose and we returned to base, a radio call came in. Simmons had been found, but not by us. He had wandered into another squad's camp miles away, barefoot, wide-eyed, his uniform torn and his skin ice cold. When they asked him what had happened, he only mumbled two words: "The clown." We tried to get answers, but he wouldn't speak. He just stared, unblinking, as if something had broken inside him. That night, they took him away. He was transferred to another base for evaluation. We never saw him again. And the clown? It was never mentioned in official reports, but we knew. We all knew. After Simmons, the sightings stopped. The night drills continued, but the air felt different, heavier. as if the ground itself held onto a secret too horrifying to speak aloud. Some of the guys whispered about it in hushed voices, saying it was something ancient, something that had been there long before Camp Pendleton. Others swore it was a ghost, a cursed spirit taking the form of a clown to feed on fear. Me? I don't know what it was. I just know that it was real. And that eerie silence? It's still there. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear it. That hollow, distant laugh. And the worst part? Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still see it. A flicker of red and white, standing at the edge of the shadows, watching, waiting. And I know whatever it is, it's not done with me yet.